At Atlanta International Airport, the morning sun streamed through the towering glass windows, casting long shadows across the bustling terminal. The atmosphere buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to their gates, but among the crowd, one figure stood out with remarkable grace and dignity. Colonel Lee, her military dress uniform adorned with decorations that told stories of courage, dedication, and 2 decades of unwavering service to her country. Just 3 hours earlier, she had been surrounded by her fellow officers at a heartfelt farewell ceremony. The walls of her old office were now bare, personal items carefully packed away in boxes, but the memories remained fresh. Her team had surprised her with a stunning glass plaque, their voices cracking with emotion as they shared stories about her leadership. Some spoke of how she'd mentored them through tough times. Others recalled her infectious laugh during early morning coffee runs, and a few couldn't help but mention her legendary ability to turn challenging situations into opportunities for growth. As she walked through the airport terminal, rolling her carry-on bag beside her, snippets of the morning celebrations played through her mind. The handwritten notes from junior officers expressing how she'd changed their lives. The way her commanding officer had smiled proudly, like a father watching his daughter graduate, as he announced her new Pentagon position. Even the usually stoic major from communications had teared up during his speech. Colonel Lee carried herself with the same quiet confidence she'd maintained throughout her 22-year journey in the military. From her first day as a fresh-faced lieutenant to this moment, she had faced every challenge with determination and grace. Her new position at the Pentagon wasn't just a personal victory. It represented hope for countless young women who dreamed of breaking barriers in military leadership. People in the terminal couldn't help but notice her presence. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing excitedly at the colonel's badges. An elderly veteran, waiting in a nearby seat, straightened his posture and offered a respectful nod. A group of college students paused their animated conversation, their eyes following her with admiration. The weight of her service medals reminded her of each milestone. Her first command position, the overseas deployments where she'd led humanitarian missions, the strategic operations that had earned her recognition from the highest levels of military leadership. But more than the medals, she cherished the memories of lives touched and changes made. Her phone buzzed with incoming messages, final goodbyes from her team. "Thank you for showing us what leadership truly means," read one message. "The Pentagon won't know what hit them," said another, followed by a laughing emoji. She smiled, remembering how she'd gradually helped her most serious staff member embrace the occasional use of emojis in informal communication. As she joined the security line, Colonel Lee reflected on the journey ahead. The Pentagon position would bring new challenges, bigger responsibilities, and opportunities to shape military policy at the highest level. She thought about the young officers she'd mentored, especially the women and minorities who saw in her a living example of what they could achieve. The morning's farewell ceremony had ended with a surprise video compilation of messages from people she'd worked with over the years. There were faces from every stage of her career, some she hadn't seen in years, others she'd worked with just yesterday. Each person shared a moment when she'd made a difference, often in ways she hadn't even realized at the time. Standing in line, her posture remained perfect, not from military training, but from the inner strength that had carried her through countless challenges. She watched families saying goodbye, business people rushing past, and young soldiers in their uniforms, reminded of her own first flight to basic training all those years ago. The security line inched forward, and Colonel Lee took a deep breath, savoring these final moments as a decorated officer heading toward her next great adventure. Little did she know that this routine airport security check would become more than just another step in her journey. It would become a moment that would spark a nationwide conversation about respect, dignity, and the ongoing fight for equal treatment, regardless of rank or accomplishment. As she approached the security checkpoint, the morning's joy and celebration still warmed her heart, making her unaware of the challenging situation that was about to unfold. A situation that would test her strength, leadership, an ability to turn adversity into positive change, just as she had done throughout her remarkable career. The line at the security checkpoint moved steadily as Colonel Lee watched fellow travelers pass through with routine efficiency. A businessman in a crisp suit walked through without issue. A family with 3 young children received patient guidance from the TSA agents. 2 white military officers, junior in rank, sailed through with quick salutes and respectful nods. As Colonel Lee stepped forward, she noticed an immediate shift in atmosphere. The young TSA agent at the document check station glanced at her, then at her military ID, his expression changing from routine boredom to something else, something she had seen too many times before. He held her ID up to the light, turning it over repeatedly, despite the holographic security features clearly visible. "Ma'am, could you step aside for additional screening?" the agent said, his tone carrying an edge that made several nearby passengers look up from their phones. Colonel Lee maintained her composure, the same way she had during countless high-pressure military operations. She'd learned long ago that dignity was her most powerful weapon in these situations. The colonel watched as another military officer, carrying the same type of identification, walked through the adjacent line without any extra scrutiny. She took a slow, measured breath, a technique she taught countless young officers dealing with difficult situations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now needed to use it herself. "Is there a problem with my identification?" she asked calmly, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone who had briefed generals and commanded troops in challenging situations. The TSA agent shifted uncomfortably but held his ground. "It's just a routine check, ma'am," he replied, though his eyes wouldn't meet hers. A small crowd had begun to form behind her, the natural bottleneck of security lines making her situation impossible to ignore. She could hear the whispers, see the phones discreetly pointing in her direction. Some faces showed confusion, others showed understanding, the kind that comes from recognizing an all-too-familiar scene playing out. The colonel thought about all the times she told young officers to pick their battles wisely. This moment, she realized, wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever stood where she stood, facing arbitrary scrutiny while wearing their country's uniform. It was about every future officer who deserved better. A second TSA agent approached, carrying a wand and wearing blue latex gloves. "We'll need to do a pat-down and thorough bag search," he announced, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The colonel noticed an elderly couple shaking their heads in disapproval, not at her, but at the situation unfolding before them. As she stood there, her neatly pressed uniform a stark contrast to the treatment she was receiving, Colonel Lee thought about the farewell ceremony from earlier that morning. The speeches about progress, about breaking barriers, about how far they'd come. Yet here she was, her decades of service seemingly invisible to the people tasked with ensuring airport security. The contents of her carry-on bag, carefully packed military documents, a laptop containing presentations for her Pentagon role, even the farewell plaque from her team, were now being removed and examined one by one. Each item represented a piece of her journey, now laid out for public scrutiny on a cold metal table. Other travelers continued to stream past, some averting their eyes, others watching with poorly concealed interest. A young girl in line with her mother pointed at the colonel's medals, asking in that loud, clear voice that only children seem to possess, "Mom, why are they doing that to her? She's a soldier." The question hung in the air, its innocence cutting through the tension like a knife. The colonel felt a familiar weight in her chest, not from anger or frustration, but from the responsibility she carried. Every time something like this happened, it wasn't just about her dignity. It was about setting an example for how to handle injustice with grace and strength. As more TSA agents gathered around her, and the situation continued to escalate, Colonel Lee stood straight and tall, her posture reflecting years of service and unwavering dedication. She knew what was coming next would require all of her leadership skills, patience, and wisdom, qualities that had earned her those medals now being eyed with suspicious scrutiny. Little did anyone know that this moment would soon transform from a personal indignity into a catalyst for change. All because one decorated officer decided that some battles need to be fought not with anger, but with unwavering dignity and a determination to make things right. The TSA agent held up Colonel Lee's military ID card under the harsh fluorescent lights for the third time. "I'm going to need additional verification," he said, his voice carrying a tone that made several nearby passengers pause their hurried airport routines. The colonel, who had led missions in 3 continents and commanded hundreds of troops, found herself in a position she never expected, having to prove she was who she said she was, despite wearing full military dress. "Officer," she began, her voice steady and clear, carrying the same authority she used in military briefings. "I've provided you with my military ID, my Pentagon clearance documents, and my travel orders. All of these are official government documents. What additional verification could you possibly need?" Around them, the usual buzz of airport activity continued, but there was a new tension in the air. A small crowd had gathered, trying to appear busy with their phones while watching the scene unfold. A young man in the line next to them had stopped pretending to check his passport and was openly recording with his phone. The agent shuffled through her documents again, his face flushed, but his stance unwavering. "Protocol requires us to be thorough, ma'am. We've had issues with forged military IDs before." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The colonel noticed how his eyes skipped over her rank insignia, her combat medals, the photographs in her official documents, all telling the same story he seemed unwilling to accept. Behind her, voices began to rise. "This is ridiculous," someone muttered. "She's a colonel, for heaven's sake," another voice added. An older gentleman in a veteran's cap stood from his nearby seat, his face clouded with concern and recognition of a familiar scene. Colonel Lee thought about the countless times she taught young officers about maintaining composure under pressure. When emotions run high, she would tell them, leadership shows in how you handle yourself. Now, standing here with her personal belongings spread across the security table, she was living those very lessons. "Sir," she said, addressing the TSA agent with deliberate calm, "I've served this country for over 2 decades. These medals," she gestured to her chest, "aren't costume jewelry. This uniform isn't the costume. I'm heading to the Pentagon for a senior position briefing, and your current actions are not just delaying me. They're disrespecting the very institution I've dedicated my life to serving." The agent's radio crackled to life. Another security officer approached, wand in hand, ready to conduct yet another scan. The colonel stood perfectly still, her posture military straight, as they passed the wand over her decorated uniform for the second time. Each beep of the scanner seemed to echo in the now hushed security area. A young girl in line with her father tugged at his sleeve. "Dad, why are they doing that to her?" she asked in a clear voice that carried. "She's a hero. Look at all her medals." The innocent observation cut through the tension, making several nearby passengers nod in agreement. The colonel thought about all the young officers she'd mentored over the years, especially those who faced similar situations. She thought about the speech she'd given just last month at a military academy, telling eager cadets that times had changed, that their service would be respected regardless of their background. The irony of her current situation wasn't lost on her. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," she finally said, her voice firm but professional. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every service member who might stand in this same spot, facing the same prejudices wrapped in the thin disguise of protocol. The atmosphere had shifted. Other passengers had stopped pretending to be occupied with their phones and luggage. The silence in the security area grew heavier, broken only by the distant announcements of flight departures and the steady beep of scanners at other checkpoints. Just then, a senior TSA officer appeared, moving quickly toward the scene. Her experienced eyes took in the situation, the decorated colonel standing tall, the growing crowd of onlookers, the younger agent's defensive posture, and the array of military documents spread across the security table. As the supervisor approached, Colonel Lee stood her ground, knowing that what happened next would matter. It would matter for every person who'd ever been singled out, every service member who'd faced unnecessary scrutiny, and every young officer watching how their senior leader handled this moment of truth. The confrontation had reached its turning point, and the next few minutes would transform this personal indignity into something much more significant. A moment that would spark change throughout the entire airport security system. The senior TSA supervisor approached the security checkpoint with quick, purposeful steps. Her eyes widened with recognition as she saw the colonel's uniform and the medals that decorated it. A warm smile spread across her face, the kind of smile that comes with genuine recognition and respect. "Colonel," the supervisor said, her voice carrying clearly above the airport noise. "I recognize you from last month's military appreciation ceremony. My husband, a retired master surgeon, still talks about your keynote speech." She turned to face the younger TSA agent, whose stance had shifted from confrontational to uncertain. The atmosphere around the security checkpoint changed instantly. The tension that had been building like a thundercloud began to dissipate. Nearby passengers, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing discomfort, let out collective sighs of relief. The young man who had been recording with his phone slowly lowered it, though he didn't stop the recording. "I deeply apologize for this situation," the supervisor continued, her professional demeanor tinged with genuine concern. She quickly gathered the colonel's documents from the security table, handling them with the respect they deserved. "Please, come with me to my office. I'd like to address this properly." As they walked away from the checkpoint, the colonel heard the supervisor quietly instructing another officer to take over the first agent's position. The whispers and murmurs from the crowd followed them, but now they carried a different tone, one of approval and relief that someone had finally stepped in. In the supervisor's office, away from the public eye, both women sat down. The small room was lined with photographs of various TSA teams and awards, but what caught the colonel's attention was a familiar military photograph on the desk. The supervisor's husband, in his dress uniform, proudly standing at his retirement ceremony. "Colonel, I want you to know that what happened out there is not what we stand for," the supervisor began, her voice carrying the weight of professional responsibility and personal understanding. "My husband served for 25 years. He faced similar situations, even in uniform. It shouldn't still be happening, especially not here, not today." The colonel watched as the supervisor pulled out an incident report form. "I'd like to document this properly," she said, her pen hovering over the paper. "Not just as a complaint, but as a teaching opportunity. We can use this to improve our training, to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Outside the office, they could hear the regular bustle of airport life continuing, announcements echoing through the terminals, the distant beeping of security scanners, the rolling of luggage wheels on tile floors. But in this small office, something important was taking shape. A moment of understanding between two professionals who had seen both sides of the story. The supervisor shared how her husband had come home one day years ago with a similar story of being stopped and questioned despite his uniform. "He told me then that change doesn't come from staying silent," she said, filling out the form with careful attention to detail. "It comes from speaking up, from documenting these moments, from turning them into opportunities for improvement." As they talked, the colonel realized this was more than just an intervention in an uncomfortable situation. It was a reminder that allies could be found in unexpected places. That change often started with individuals willing to stand up and say, "This isn't right." The supervisor detailed her plans for immediate action: additional training sessions, review of protocols, and a department-wide memo about proper treatment of military personnel. But more importantly, she spoke about the human element, the need for empathy, respect, and understanding in their work. "Your Pentagon meeting," the supervisor suddenly remembered, checking her watch. She quickly picked up her phone, making a swift call to expedite the colonel's passage through a different security checkpoint. "We'll have you on your way in just a few minutes." As they stood to leave the office, the supervisor paused. "Colonel," she said, her voice softer now, more personal. "Thank you for handling this with such dignity. You could have gotten angry, made a scene. Instead, you showed the kind of leadership that will help us make real changes." Walking back into the terminal, both women knew that what had started as a confrontation had transformed into something more meaningful. A catalyst for change, a moment of connection, and a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice is the combination of quiet dignity and determined action. In the privacy of the TSA office, something shifted in Colonel Lee's carefully maintained composure. Away from the public eye, sitting in a comfortable chair across from the sympathetic supervisor, the weight of the morning's events finally settled on her shoulders. Her hands, which had remained steady while handling military operations in combat zones, trembled slightly as she accepted a cup of water. "It's not just about today," she said quietly, her voice carrying years of similar experiences. The colonel's eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the office walls, seeing memories rather than the present moment. "Do you know what it's like to iron your uniform extra crisp, polish your boots until they shine like mirrors, and make sure every metal is perfectly aligned, just so people might look past their assumptions?" The supervisor leaned forward, her face showing genuine concern as she listened. The colonel continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I've commanded units in 3 different continents. I've coordinated relief efforts during natural disasters. I've led troops through situations that would make most people freeze with fear. Yet here I am, having to prove I belong in this uniform." She paused, taking a sip of water to steady herself. Outside the office, they could hear the muffled sounds of the airport. Announcements echoing through terminals, the distant beeping of security scanners, the constant hum of travelers rushing to their destinations. But in this quiet room, years of accumulated stress and dignity were finally finding their voice. "Last week," the colonel continued, "I spoke to a group of young cadets at the academy. Bright, eager faces looking up at me, believing things have changed. I told them that dedication and hard work would be recognized, that the uniform commands respect." A bitter laugh escaped her. "And then this happens, proving that some things haven't changed as much as we'd like to believe." The supervisor pulled out a tissue box, sliding it across the desk without comment. It was a gesture of understanding rather than pity. The colonel took one, dabbing at eyes that had remained dry through countless challenges, but now threatened to overflow. "You know what hurts the most?" she asked, straightening her already perfect posture. "It's not the personal insult. It's thinking about all those young officers watching us right now. The ones in uniform who saw what happened, the ones in civilian clothes who might think twice about wearing their uniform to the airport. Every time something like this happens, it chips away at their confidence, their pride in service." The supervisor nodded, her own experience as a military spouse giving her a unique perspective. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the strongest thing we can do is acknowledge that it hurts, that it's not okay. That being strong doesn't mean we have to pretend it doesn't affect us." The colonel's hand went to her chest, fingers brushing against the medals that represented years of service, sacrifice, and determination. "Each of these tells a story," she said. "This one, from a humanitarian mission in Southeast Asia. This one, leading an evacuation during a natural disaster. But none of them seemed to matter today. None of them were enough to prove I belonged in this uniform." As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, more resolved. The moment of vulnerability wasn't breaking her. It was transforming into something more powerful. "We have to do better," she said firmly. "Not just for me, but for every service member who walks through these checkpoints. For every young officer who deserves to wear their uniform with pride, without fear of humiliation." The supervisor was already pulling out forms, her pen ready. "Then let's make sure this matters," she said. "Let's document everything. Every detail, every word. Let's make this moment count for something more than just one bad experience. The colonel nodded, her composure returning but different now, more authentic, more human. She had shown that even the strongest leaders carry heavy burdens, that vulnerability and strength aren't opposites but partners in the journey toward change. As they began to work on the formal documentation, both women understood that this moment of honesty, this brief breaking point, wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, the start of something that could make a real difference in how people in uniform were treated, regardless of their appearance or background. The office clock ticked steadily as Colonel Lee and the TSA supervisor worked together, their focus intense as they captured every detail of the morning's events. The colonel's voice remained steady as she described each moment, each interaction, each subtle gesture that had made the situation so troubling. At approximately 9:15 hours, she dictated, watching as the supervisor's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. I approached Security Checkpoint B with my military ID and orders clearly displayed. The clicking of keys filled the small office as they worked to ensure nothing was overlooked. The supervisor paused her typing, reaching for a different form. We should also pull the security camera footage, she said, her expression determined. Visual evidence makes these reports harder to dismiss. She picked up her phone, quickly arranging for the footage to be preserved before it could be routinely overwritten. As they worked, the colonel recalled similar incidents she'd witnessed or heard about from other officers. You know, she said, straightening a medal that had shifted slightly on her uniform. Most people just let these things go. They worry about making waves, about being labeled difficult. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But sometimes staying quiet is more damaging than speaking up. The supervisor nodded, pulling up another document on her computer. This is our standard operating procedure for military personnel, she explained, turning the screen so the colonel could see it. I want to show you exactly where protocol was broken today. This isn't just about feelings or perceptions. It's about documented procedures being ignored. Together, they'd highlighted each deviation from standard procedure, the unnecessary additional screening, the questioning of valid military ID, the public nature of the extended examination. The colonel's military training showed in how methodically she approached the documentation, ensuring each point was backed by specific examples and timestamps. We should also note the witnesses, the supervisor suggested, referring to the crowd that had gathered. Several passengers were recording. In today's world, these things don't stay private for long. She was right. In the age of social media, incidents like this could quickly become catalysts for broader conversations about respect, dignity, and equal treatment. The colonel thought about the young girl who had pointed out her medals, her innocent question cutting through the tension of the moment. Include the children who were present, she said quietly. They shouldn't have to see something like this. They shouldn't learn that a uniform means different things depending on who's wearing it. As they worked, the supervisor shared her own plans for immediate action. I'm implementing mandatory refresher training for all checkpoint staff, she said, adding notes to a separate document. And I want you to know that the agent involved will be required to complete additional cultural awareness training. The colonel nodded, appreciating that the response focused on education rather than punishment. It's not about getting anyone in trouble, she agreed. It's about making sure this becomes a learning opportunity for everyone involved. They reviewed the security camera footage together, the black and white images clearly showing the incident from multiple angles. The colonel watched herself standing tall throughout the ordeal, her dignity intact even as her authority was being questioned. It was strange, seeing herself from this perspective, seeing how others must have seen her. I'd like to add something, the colonel said, straightening in her chair. This isn't just about military personnel. This is about every professional who faces similar treatment. Every person who has to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. The supervisor paused her typing, looking up with understanding. You're right, she said. This report could help us improve procedures across the board. She opened a new section in the document, titled Broader Implications and Recommendations. As they finished the documentation, both women knew they had created more than just a report. They had created a template for change, a document that could help prevent similar incidents in the future. The colonel's willingness to speak up, combined with the supervisor's dedication to proper documentation, had transformed an unfortunate incident into an opportunity for systemic improvement. The final page of the report contained their recommendations for policy changes, training updates, and ongoing monitoring of security checkpoint interactions. It wasn't just a complaint. It was a roadmap for positive change, crafted by two professionals who understood the importance of turning difficult moments into opportunities for growth and improvement. Word of what happened at the security checkpoint spread quickly through both the TSA and military communities. Within days, video clips captured by passengers had circulated widely, sparking intense discussions about respect, dignity, and equal treatment. The colonel's poised response to the situation became a talking point in break rooms and briefing sessions across the country. The airport administration didn't wait for public pressure to act. By the end of the week, they had launched a comprehensive review of their screening procedures. Conference rooms that usually hosted routine meetings were now filled with senior officials poring over security protocols, looking for gaps that needed addressing. "Look at this," one airport official said during a meeting, pointing to the incident report the colonel and supervisor had carefully prepared. "The thoroughness of this documentation gives us exactly what we need to make real changes." The report's clear, detailed account left no room for dismissal or denial of the issues at hand. In the TSA break room, officers gathered during shift changes, discussing the incident in hushed tones. "I watched the whole thing," one veteran officer shared with his colleagues. 20 years on this job, and it made me rethink everything about how we approach our work." Others nodded, sharing their own experiences and perspectives. The young TSA agent involved in the incident sat through additional training sessions, but something unexpected happened. Instead of being defensive, he became an advocate for change. "I thought I was just following protocol," he told his supervisor during a follow-up meeting. "But now I understand how procedures can become excuses for not seeing the person in front of us." Military channels buzzed with the news as well. Senior officers shared the story during leadership meetings, using it as a teaching moment about dignity under pressure. Junior officers discussed it in their units, many sharing similar experiences they'd never felt comfortable talking about before. The airport's response went beyond mere policy changes. They established a new advisory board that included military veterans, civil rights advocates, and security experts. Together, they began developing training programs that would help officers balance security requirements with respect for individual dignity. At the Pentagon, where the colonel had arrived late but unshaken for her briefing that day, senior military leadership took notice. "We need to address this systematically," one general announced during a staff meeting. "Not just for our officers, but for every service member who travels in uniform." The colonel received hundreds of messages from service members across the country. Some shared similar stories, while others expressed gratitude for her composure and courage in addressing the situation. "Your handling of this situation taught me more about leadership than any training manual," wrote one young lieutenant. Local news stations picked up the story, not for its controversy, but for its resolution. They'd highlighted how the airport's swift and constructive response could serve as a model for other institutions facing similar challenges. The focus wasn't on blame, but on progress and positive change. Transportation hubs across the country began reaching out to the airport, asking about their new training programs and revised procedures. What had started as an unfortunate incident was transforming into a nationwide conversation about respect, dignity, and professional courtesy. The TSA supervisor who had intervened found herself being invited to speak at training sessions for other airports. "It's not just about following procedures," she would tell her audiences. "It's about recognizing the humanity in every person who comes through our checkpoints." In break rooms and briefing sessions, security officers began sharing stories about positive interactions with military personnel, creating a new culture of understanding and respect. The incident had opened up conversations that many had been hesitant to have before. The colonel continued her duties at the Pentagon, but her experience became part of a larger narrative about leadership and dignity. When asked about the incident, she would always emphasize the positive changes that emerged from it. Sometimes, she would say, the most important victories come from our most challenging moments. As weeks passed, the airport's new procedures began showing results. Security screenings became more efficient, complaints decreased, and both officers and travelers reported more positive interactions. What had started as a moment of confrontation had evolved into an opportunity for genuine improvement. 3 months after the airport incident, the colonel stood before a packed auditorium at the National Transportation Security Conference. Military medals gleaming under the bright lights, she faced an audience of TSA trainers, airport security managers, and policymakers from across the country. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "We're not here to point fingers," she began, her voice carrying to the back of the room. "We're here because one difficult morning showed us how much we still need to learn from each other." The audience leaned forward, many taking notes as she shared her story, not with anger, but with purpose. Behind her, a large screen displayed training materials developed from her experience. What had started as a single incident report had grown into a comprehensive program. Screenshots showed real-world scenarios, body language guides, and communication techniques designed to help security officers handle sensitive situations. "Look at this photograph," she said, gesturing to an image of a diverse group of service members. "Each uniform tells a story. Each medal represents sacrifice. But more importantly, each person wearing them deserves to be treated with the same respect, regardless of what they look like." The training program she helped develop wasn't just about military personnel. It addressed broader issues of unconscious bias, professional courtesy, and the delicate balance between security protocols and human dignity. Role-playing exercises helped officers understand how their actions and words could impact travelers. During breaks, security officers shared their own experiences. A veteran TSA trainer approached the colonel with tears in her eyes. "I've been trying to explain these issues for years," she said. "Your program finally puts into words what we've been feeling but couldn't express." The colonel worked closely with psychology experts and cultural awareness specialists to ensure the training resonated with everyone. They created scenarios that challenged assumptions and encouraged officers to think critically about their decision-making processes. "Remember," she told the audience, "every person who comes through your checkpoint has a story. They might be heading to a job interview, rushing to see a sick relative, or reporting for military duty. Our job is to maintain security while preserving their dignity." The program included practical exercises. Security officers practiced handling difficult situations through simulation exercises. They learned to recognize when their own biases might be affecting their judgment, and how to maintain professional standards while showing respect for every traveler. Airport administrators from different states began implementing the training. They reported improved interactions between officers and travelers, fewer complaints, and more efficient security processes. The program's success caught the attention of other organizations facing similar challenges. One afternoon, during a training session in Chicago, a young security officer raised his hand. "I used to think following protocol meant being suspicious of everyone," he admitted. "Now I understand that true security comes from building trust and respect with the people we serve." The colonel's inbox filled with messages from airports reporting positive changes. Security checkpoints became places where professionalism and courtesy went hand in hand with thorough screening procedures. Officers learned to communicate clearly and respectfully, even in challenging situations. Transportation security agencies in other countries began requesting information about the program. What had started as a response to one incident was becoming a model for change in airports worldwide. The colonel found herself consulting with international security experts, sharing lessons learned from that morning at the checkpoint. During one training session, an older TSA officer stood up. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, he said. But this program made me realize I've been on autopilot. Now I see each person as an individual, not just another traveler to process." The training emphasized practical solutions. Officers learned specific phrases to use, body language to adopt, and ways to de-escalate tense situations. They practiced scenarios involving different uniforms, ranks, and situations they might encounter. Back at the Pentagon, the colonel continued her regular duties, but her impact reached far beyond her military role. The training program she helped create was changing how people thought about security, respect, and professional interaction. "This isn't just about making things better for people in uniform," she would often say during training sessions. "It's about creating a security system that protects everyone while treating them with the dignity they deserve. That's not just good policy, it's good humanity." 1 year after the incident, Colonel Lee found herself walking through Atlanta International Airport again. The morning sun streamed through the same windows, but everything else felt different. As she approached the security checkpoint, she noticed subtle but significant changes. The first thing she saw was a large poster displaying various military uniforms and credentials, helping officers quickly recognize different ranks and insignias. Next to it, a sign read, "We honor those who serve," in simple, dignified letters. But it wasn't just the visual changes that caught her attention. It was the atmosphere. The TSA supervisor who had helped her that day spotted her first, walking over with a warm smile. "Colonel, welcome back," she said, greeting her like an old friend. "Would you like to see what your courage helped create?" Together, they watched the security checkpoint in operation. A young officer in Air Force uniform approached the checkpoint. The TSA agent checking IDs smiled professionally, examined the credentials efficiently, and thanked the officer for their service, all without missing a beat in the security procedure. The interaction was smooth, respectful, and exactly as it should be. "Look there," the supervisor pointed out quietly. Near the screening area, a small team of officers was conducting their morning briefing. On their clipboards were the training materials that had grown from the colonel's experience. "We start every shift by reviewing proper procedures and discussing respectful interaction scenarios." The colonel noticed how the agents maintained eye contact with travelers, how they explained procedures clearly and professionally, how they handled questions with patience and respect. The change wasn't just in the rules, it was in the culture itself. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip passed through the checkpoint, their teacher explaining how airport security worked. The colonel overheard an agent taking a moment to show them his badge, explaining his job with pride and professionalism. These were the kind of positive interactions that would shape the next generation's understanding of security and respect. Near the checkpoint, she recognized the young TSA agent from last year, the one who had questioned her credentials. He was now training new officers, emphasizing both security protocols and respectful treatment. "Remember," she heard him say, "everyone who comes through here deserves to be treated with dignity." The supervisor shared some statistics. Complaints were down by 60%, processing times had improved, and officer job satisfaction had increased significantly. "But the numbers don't tell the whole story," she said. "It's the small moments of respect and understanding that really show how far we've come." As they walked through the terminal, several officers nodded respectfully to the colonel, recognizing her not from last year's incident, but from the training videos that had helped transform their approach to their work. Her story had become part of their professional development, a lesson in how to balance security with dignity. Near the gates, they passed a wall displaying thank you notes from travelers. Among them were letters from service members, civilian professionals, and ordinary citizens, all sharing stories of positive experiences at the security checkpoint. The wall stood as a testament to what could be achieved when respect became a priority. The colonel watched as a diverse group of travelers moved through security: business people, families, military personnel of all backgrounds. Each person received the same professional, respectful treatment. The change wasn't special treatment for some, it was equal treatment for all. Before leaving, the supervisor handed her a bound report, a one-year assessment of the changes implemented since that day. Your experience could have ended with just a complaint, she said. Instead, it became a catalyst for real change. That's a true legacy. The colonel thought about all the young officers who would pass through these checkpoints, wearing their uniforms with pride, knowing they would be treated with the respect they deserved. She thought about all the travelers who would experience security screening as it should be, professional, efficient, and dignified. As she headed toward her gate, she passed another military officer going through security. The interaction she witnessed was everything she had hoped for: professional, respectful, efficient. The officer's medals caught the morning sun, just as hers had a year ago. But this time, they were met with immediate recognition and respect. End of standing up for what's right. And that true leadership means turning challenges into opportunities for lasting improvement.